Welcome to the Great Hall, home to many thought-provoking and community-empowering conversations. My name is Lisa Lothian, and I am the head of Outreach Services for the Nantucket Athenaeum. We are proud to be Nantucket's free public library and gathering place, transforming lives with resources and experiences that support lifelong learning for all. We couldn't do it without support from friends like you. A very special thank you to Trustee Emerita Nan Geschke, whose inspiring work, support, and vision for public libraries has benefited the Nantucket Athenaeum for decades. Thank you, Nan. Tonight's facilitator is Janet Steinmeier, Athenaeum trustee and president of Lesley University of Cambridge, Massachusetts, a private university focused on supporting the professions of education, mental health, and art and design through partnerships with the organizations that employ these practitioners. Janet will be interviewing Dr. Koppell, president of Montclair State University, an advocate for the role of universities as engines of public good and insurers of a diverse leadership pipeline in America. Through Koppell's leadership, Montclair has been establishing a model for a differentiated liberal arts college within a public university. Please help me welcome them.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to Nantucket and to the Athenaeum, and thank you for ferrying over, Jonathan, from the Vineyard.
I said it's a very hard assignment to come here in the middle of the summer, so I struggled to get here, but it's a great pleasure and actually honor to be part of this series.
Terrific. Well, we're in a very historic room, so we'll start by talking about higher ed right now in history, because higher ed has the distinction of being in the headlines a lot now, particularly around the value of higher ed. And I think somebody I spoke to was looking into colleges right now. Yeah. What do you say to students and parents when they ask about the value of higher ed?
Yeah, and just to start where you started, it's a really unusual time. I can't remember, and obviously I think of this more as a conversation. I've got another distinguished higher ed leader right next to me. I can't remember a time where higher education was not only so much of a subject that people are discussing, but actually a target and a vehicle for division. That's something new, I think, in our country, and so it's a very unusual time. And let me start by saying, in answer to that question about the value of college, that when we answer that question, we have to be sure not to fall into the trap which drives me crazy, which is that the window on all things higher education starts with that other school in Cambridge that you probably are familiar with. And we act as if you just talk about Harvard and Columbia and the Ivy League, well, now you're actually talking about higher education in America. There's nothing wrong with those schools. I know them well. I got a degree there. I worked for another one. But they are so unrepresentative of higher education in our country and so limited as a source of insight into the state of higher education in America that it does a huge disservice to every topic we'll talk about tonight to start and end with the Ivy League. It just doesn't make any sense. So the answer to the question about value of college is anybody who suggests it's not worth it to get a college degree is simply denying reality. I mean, that's just, no matter how you measure it, and we'll talk about debt and the affordability issue, but no matter how you measure it from a income point of view, from a health point of view, from a well-being point of view, you're far better off if you have a college degree than if you don't have one. Doesn't mean everybody should get a college degree. It doesn't mean that you're not a valuable human being if you decide not to get a college degree, but you are better off if you have a college degree, and everybody should have the chance, whether they take it or not, to get a college degree. That's unambiguous. One of the things that concerns me about the conversation of the value of college is that the entire conversation is individual, right? So we just say, is it worth it to this person to get a college degree? And the way that we measure that is what's their lifetime earnings. So there's multiple problems, because college is supposed to be more than just income, and not everybody who goes to college is simply trying to make as much money as possible. Some people, like your students, they want to be nurses, they want to be social workers, they want to be artists, they want to be teachers. None of those people think they're going to be as rich as Bill Gates by doing those things. And so measuring it simply by what's your income is a mistake. But there's a bigger issue, which is that we've totally forgotten that education is supposed to be a public good. And we've lost the idea of public goods in this country. And it's particularly true around education. The country is stronger when education is more widely available. And the democratization of access to higher education was a huge source of economic vitality, whether you're talking about in the 19th century or more recently with the GI Bill that dramatically expanded access to college. And so we need to measure the value of college in a much more comprehensive way, both on an individual basis, but particularly on a public basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've spoken also about the value of universities to their communities, that town and gown isn't what it used to be. And I have to say, as the university that goes in with your alma mater, Harvard, and MIT, and Little Leslie, to talk about what we do. We all do a lot of things for our community, and maybe talk a little bit about that and that larger picture.
Yeah, and that's right. The point that I made just is the tip of the iceberg. Universities can and should, and to some extent do, deeply engage communities and should be transformative, and that's not appreciated either. First of all, just in ordinary course of operations, they're sources of employment, they're engines of economic activity, they're creators of solutions, right? We're all able to gather because universities were doing COVID research, COVID-related research that led to the rapid innovation of a vaccine. That was a remarkable achievement. That was decades in the making because of what universities do. What we're trying to do at Montclair is sort of take that idea and ratchet it up several levels and say, look, if we are not addressing the needs of the communities around us in a direct, intentional way, we're falling short of what our responsibilities are. So the way I say it is we're a public university because our mission is to serve the public interest. Not just because we get some increasingly small share of our budget from the state. And it does go down. It does go down every year. But that means that in a community like Paterson, I don't know how many New Jersey people we have in the room. I see a couple of hands. In a community like Paterson, which is 4 miles from Montclair, Montclair being one of the most prosperous communities in New Jersey, and Paterson, a struggling, gritty city, with really horrible outcomes from an educational point of view, from an economic point of view, we've said, look, we need to be there. That's our mission. Yeah, we're not technically in Paterson, but it's right there. And how can we say we're doing well when you have school systems struggling, when you have unemployment rates above 50%, when you have health outcomes in one zip code where life expectancy is 10, 15 years less than adjacent zip codes? How can we say, as a public serving university, that we're fulfilling our mission? And I think that universities in general are doing a lot. I agree with that. But I don't think they're doing enough, quite frankly. And if we were to talk about the Harvards or the MITs of the world, I would say, well, with that gigantic endowment that you have, what responsibility are you taking for people in Cambridge? I mean, I'll be frank about it. I don't think that they're owning that. And I think that's something that maybe we'll get to talk about that more broadly. But I think that's part of why we have ended up where higher education is in the crosshairs. Some of that is richly deserved.
Sure. And so how do you approach that? You're thinking about how you as a university can help with these problems of a very large municipality. Where do you start? Where do you start those conversations?
So I start by thinking about two things. So one is, do we fully appreciate the capacity of universities? I don't think we do, right? These are communities of thousands of energetic, idealistic, motivated people, and they're there to learn, and the best way to learn is by actually doing. So you can create learning opportunities by engaging communities and coming up with work that is both beneficial to the community and beneficial to the students and beneficial to researchers. The second place that you have to start, and I think this is where a lot of universities fall down, and I learned it by making mistakes myself, you have to ask the community what they want. Right? So a lot of universities say, well, we engage the community, we do service, and it's like, oh, really? What do you do? It's like, well, we took this project that we wanted to do into the community. It's like, well, did they want that? It's like, well, they didn't say no. And so I've been involved in a multiple projects. The signature initiative is something called 1 Square Mile, and where we take 1 square mile of Patterson, and it's something that I did at my previous institution, Arizona State University. We did this in Phoenix and said, what if within 1 square mile, we tried to systematically use the resources of the university and other community organizations to address every need, educational, public safety, health. And the premise is that within that area, unless you address everything, you're not going to make a difference. We all know that intellectually, right? So if I started an after-school reading program, we would say, well, is that really going to work? Because if the kids are hungry, and if they're unsafe, and if they don't have clothing, and if their parents are working 3 jobs, can that program really work? And the answer is not really. And yet, we forget about that when we evaluate the program 2 years later, right? And we say it's a failure. So we've tried to put all of those things together, but we started by asking the community, what do you want to see? Mm-hmm. And you build that trust. And so I think a lot of universities, even when they try and do good things, are seen as an invading force, treating the community as research subjects rather than partners. That's never going to work. It's never going to be greeted with enthusiasm, and so you have to learn how to do this in a different way.
Sure. And so it sounds like you're more of a convener, and you are convening a group of organizations in order to affect a community. And how do you do that?
I think that's part of it. Part of it is being a convener, and it's exciting to see that happen. One thing that I think people often have a misperception of is that in communities that are poor and struggling, there's a sort of idea, well, I guess people don't care, and I guess people aren't trying to help their own community. That's not true. You go into a place like Patterson, there are dozens of organizations doing great things, but there's nobody who's coordinating. The term I use is there's nobody who's a systems integrator. So you'll have people on the same block who aren't even aware of each other, and you have people who are doing things that should be complementary, but there's nobody whose job it is to coordinate. And you might say, well, that's government's job, but government can't even coordinate itself. And so the university can be that systems integrator, that coordinator, and we can help develop the capacity. And we've been doing that. We did that in Arizona. We're doing that, and there's a group of institutions around the country. We're not the only one. I don't want to pretend that like we're creating what are called backbone organizations. And there's an enormous energy in the community, but the end result is not what it should be because nobody's knitting it all together. Mm-hmm. And so it's exciting to see that come to fruition. It happens very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to shift gears here and talk a little bit about access to higher education now. And how do you create those pathways for people to be able to have a university or college experience? And how do you take away the barriers that sometimes...
Yeah, and I think access is a really important topic. And that's part of the reason why, by the way, I have nothing against elite schools, but the premise of elite schools, they'll tell you, like, what's the first thing that these schools want to tell you? How many people they reject. I mean, that's essentially what they're saying, right? Well, only 3% people get in. We're so used to that it doesn't even sound weird anymore. It's really bizarre. Like, how do you know we're good? Because we reject most people. Strange, right? To me, the measure of whether you're a good school or not is what happens to the person in the time that they're there. And the funny part is that a lot of those schools don't even talk about that. Like, how is the person different on the last day than the first day? That should be the measure of the quality of a school, right? Nope, they don't really tell me about that. They might tell me like who goes to what graduate school or not, but they've already filtered to get the people in. So they could have sit there just looking at their phone for 4 years, and probably some of them do. And they still would have done just fine at the end of 4 years. So the question should be, what is the quality of the program? And how do you get more people access to high quality programs so that they can fulfill their potential? And so I'm always very careful when we talk about access not to let the implication go that access means lower quality. It shouldn't mean lower quality, and it can't mean lower quality, because then you're not really delivering on the premise of inclusiveness. And so I think this is a really critical conversation, and I don't know if we'll talk about the affirmative action decision. I know that's what a lot of people want to talk about in higher ed these days, and it's significant, but to be honest, the marginal effect of how 20 seats at Harvard are going to get allocated is not going to be significant when we talk about social justice or equity or economic mobility in this country. It's just too tiny. These are tiny, it's a small number of institutions and tiny populations at each one. The way that the needle moves is institutions like Montclair, and Arizona State, where I was before, where the premise is, if you can do college level work, we will make a place for you, and we will provide every opportunity for you to fulfill your potential. That's the premise. That has to be the premise. And so it can't be some diluted version of higher education. I'm deeply concerned that that's under threat for a lot of different reasons. Cost, the investment in higher education that I already alluded to, the preparation at the K-12 level that puts people in a position to do college level work. There are a lot of different forces that are aligning against it. And let's go back to the public goods idea. The reason why this is important is not just for the individuals. It is important for the individuals. And if you've spent any time with graduates of places like Montclair, first generation college students, that's about half of our population. It transforms families. It transforms the trajectory of everybody that comes after that person. It's a remarkable thing to see in real time. But we need those people as a society, because if they're not educated, we're going to be sticking it to ourselves. New Jersey's a perfect example. So New Jersey has one of the highest unemployment rates in the country and one of the highest rates of unfilled jobs in the country. So you're like, wait a second. so I mean, but it tells the whole story right there. Why? Because the jobs that are unfilled required an educated populace that we're not creating because of the inequity in the K-12 system that leaves a significant portion of the population unable to go to college and thus unprepared to fill those jobs. So it's a perfect example of how we all suffer if we don't get this, right, and if we don't fix this system.
Yeah, so it's a very neat and sophisticated idea that we would start to measure universities by what the outcomes are, not only in terms of ROI, but in terms of how you've transformed the lives of people. How could that possibly come about when you've got U.S. News and Report measuring people by exactly what you said? How many do you reject?
And so people are trying, though. Even U.S. News is trying, and we work with them to sort of promote other ways of thinking about it. So one of their measures and I'm like every university president who will say, rankings are stupid, they don't mean anything, they don't tell you the full story. And by the way, have you seen our rankings? So we're ranked among the top 10 institutions from a social mobility point of view, and here's how lots of people are trying to measure this. So here's how they tried to measure it. They said, essentially, let's look at what the expected graduation rate for a college is. And you might say, well, how would you know what the expected graduation rate for a college is? And the answer is, you look at the socioeconomic profile of the student population. By the way, it's a sad statement in a way, because you'd say, well, shouldn't you look at the GPA? And the answer is no. The best predictor of graduation rate is not grades, it's family income and wealth. That's life in the United States, just by the way. And so they said, well, let's look at a college and say, what's the expected graduation rate given the socioeconomic profile of the student population? And then let's look at the actual graduation rate. In some ways saying, what's the value add? And so Montclair's graduation rate is about 15 percentage points higher than what you'd expect it to be given the population that we serve. That's one of the highest deltas in the country. Then we get an added bonus in some ways because our graduation rate is more or less the same when you start sorting out by race and ethnicity. And that's very unusual because you unfortunately have differentiated rates. And so we're really proud of that because go back to let's look at how they are when they come in and how they are when they're done. And so that's an attempt to measure it. The Wall Street Journal tried to do it a different way, an interesting way. So the Wall Street Journal said, given the cost of a degree from a particular institution, and particularly the marginal cost, right? So how much more you pay to get a degree, I'll stick with us, because obviously I like to talk about us. The added cost of a Montclair degree versus the average, what is the time it takes to pay for that added cost, given the marginal effect on income with that degree? And so I know that's a little bit less easy to understand, but I see a lot of nods. And so it turns out we ended up ranked 4th in New Jersey on that. And usually people don't shout, we're number 4. I know that, but that's pretty good because that's behind Princeton is number 1. And why is Princeton number 1? Because basically if you make less than $110,000 a year, you don't pay anything to go to Princeton. And a lot of people have enough money that they just write a check, so they don't have any debt. And it turns out a Princeton degree gets you a pretty good salary. Number 2 and 3 were NJIT, the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and the Stevens Institute of Technology. They basically train engineers, architects. So those people earn a lot of money. We're number 4 after those. And that's our graduates, our teachers, nurses, social workers, artists, a lot of things other than business, which means that they're in a position to pay for the Montclair education. And why do I think that's important? It goes back to the access and quality, because they're getting a high quality degree that sets them up for success. So that's why access without quality is a false reward. And so you have to, because otherwise the degree doesn't pay for itself. And that doesn't even get into the people who don't finish. We'll get to that. That's another big issue.
Absolutely. And actually, in these Olympic days, being number 4 looks pretty darn good. So
you're not on the podium. You're not on the podium. That's all about being on the podium.
So you're doing this incredible work. You're making a difference to many people's lives. You're making a difference to communities. Why are people so negative about higher education?
Again, so this is where I'm probably a little different than some of my colleagues who get very defensive and say it's totally unfair. Like, we have to own some stuff. So let's own some stuff. So one is, and we'll get to the more recent political stuff, I'm sure, but so one is a lot of people don't finish. That's reality. And so, you've obviously all heard about the debt issue. The reality is that the debt issue is not such a big deal for people who finish college. Yeah, I can find one story of somebody who got a poetry degree and now they're in debt. Sure, I can find bad stories. Almost 40% of the outstanding student debt is people who never got a degree. That's the problem. That's the problem. And even I'll brag about our completion rate, which is among the best, but it's a little under 70%, which is, I'm glad to be among the best, but 70%, that means almost a third of our students never got a degree. And that's a good rate. There are colleges that are 50, 40, 30%. And so go back to the question of, is a college degree worth it? So this is the part that people won't say when they get all angry and how dare you say that a college degree is not worth it. If you start college and don't finish, you're probably worse off than if you never started. That's reality. You've got debt, you've wasted time, you're psychologically damaged from the experience, and so here, yeah, so I like to throw out numbers. Here's one that's amazing. There are more people in this country who went to college without a degree than with a degree. Now, again, that's why talking about Harvard and Princeton, whatever, like, because everybody who goes to those schools finish. But that's not how most people go to college. And so most people go to college, they start, they stop, they go, they fall. So more people don't have a degree. So of course, all these people went to college thinking they were going to get a degree and they were going to be successful and their life was going to be transformed, and then they never got it. So yeah, they're mad. Like, they're mad, and they think college they think it's a con game, right? Because they got screwed. Some of that's for profits, some of that's fly-by-night institutions, but not only. And so I think that's a big part. That's a big part of the anger. By the way, again, own our issues. Around 20% of people who do have college degrees are not earning more than they would have earned without a college degree. So that's a problem. And if you want to talk about like little flashing warning lights on the horizon, this is where artificial intelligence is a little scary, because a lot of the entry points for people with college degrees are going to disappear. And so that's going to be the question, is what are going to be the jobs for recent college grads 10 years from now, 20 years from now? I'm willing to go along with the sort of techno-optimists who like, there's always something new, but it is a concern. I think a second reason why people are frustrated with higher education is that a lot of institutions have not embraced the idea that I was articulating, that we need to be relevant and concerned about the world around us. Mm-hmm. And they see colleges with $30 billion endowments, and they see a lot of privilege and a lot of wealth, and they don't see how those institutions are taking responsibility and making a difference. It seems very selfish, it seems very self-referential, and it's frustrating. I understand that. So that's partially why I want to do something different. But I can understand why people would be frustrated with it. And then a third reason, I think, has to do with the politics and the misalignment and some of the stuff that we've seen over the last year, and quite frankly, the weaponization of higher education as a wedge issue. So when people are saying all kinds of horrible things about higher education, it turns out that makes a difference.
Sure. But kind of focusing on the student for a moment, one of the big issues is mental health and the stress that these students are under. And so what have you done within Montclair State to address that and to make it more possible for people to finish?
I think that's something for those of us who went to college 20 plus years ago, I'm being generous, 20 plus years ago, that's one of the most unrecognizable aspects of college today. And some of it's good in a way, that it would have been very stigmatizing when I was in college, and I would imagine a lot of you have a similar view, to say, I'm going to get therapy, or I need to go and get counseling. People wouldn't do that. They would be reluctant to do that. Students today, over 70% expect they're going to need counseling when they get to college. And one of the most challenging aspects of running a university today is the mental health needs of our students. They are in crisis. We had a tragic year. We had more than one suicide on campus this year. That was very unusual for our institution, but it wasn't unusual for higher education. In our state alone, there was a weird, particular trend of people jumping off the top of parking garages. And so literally, I mean, just to tell you how serious this is, literally presidents were talking to each other about how you were going about putting protective fencing up on your garages to slow this down. That's conversations that we're having. Happily, the bigger conversation is, how are we doing more provision of resources, counselors, telehealth has become a big thing for this. The future has to be, how do we train people to take care of their own mental health? But when you talk about why do people not finish college, mm-hmm. this is a big reason. It's not just money. Everybody says, oh, it's money.
Yes.
This is a big reason.
Huge.
The stress, And our students have an enormous amount of stress because they're, again, take the paradigm of the Ivy League student out of your head, right? My students are working, they often have families, they're taking care of parents, they're taking care of siblings. And when I say working, I don't mean like they're working a couple hours at the library. I mean, like, I was talking to a young man who does the overnight shift at UPS. He does that every night, and then he comes back to school in the morning. And so, like, that takes a toll, both obviously physically, but also mentally. And so these are the realities for many students, not every student, but many students today. And you know, we all walk around with these things, which is like a little toxic, you know, bomb that is affecting our students in a real way, society, but students in particular. I assume that you have the same
Absolutely.
issue at Lesley, even though it's a very different environment.
Yes, exactly. And we are so much smaller that we are able to really track students a lot more, perhaps, than is possible at a huge
It's a
public university.
different dynamic, right?
Exactly. I want to shift a little bit and talk about elite institutions, because you've hit on that point a few times, and I'm guessing that there are people here who have gone to Ivies and Ivy Pluses and Seven Sisters. I think I see a few. What is it that you think we all need to do in order to bring about something that's more equitable in society, and to maybe push the elites a little bit to play the role you'd like to see them play?
So I think there's two things. This may sound like a funny thing. We can push them. They're not going to fundamentally change. They have a good business model that works. So they're not going to say, like, we need to be more democratic. Like, and you want to understand, like, what I mean by this. So Stanford University raises $1 billion a year. I'm not talking about how much they earn off their endowment. They raise $1 billion a year. They haven't grown by a single student in 25 years. Like, just wrap your brain around that for a second. Like, so they're just spending more money to educate the same number of people, and it has consequences. Your professors earn more because Harvard's throwing money around like a drunken sailor, right? So they're not. I don't think they're fundamentally going to change. I think they should be pushed, but I don't think they're going to fundamentally change. But we can change. We can change. So we need to think more about the decisions we make when we're hiring people, when we're inviting speakers. So you don't normally get the president of Montclair State University, right? Mm-hmm. I'm just being honest, right? And when we're letting people into law schools and graduate programs, there was a study. I bet many people saw this study because it got a lot of attention when the affirmative action debate. A Harvard economist named Raj Chetty did this study, and he said, look, here's why affirmative action and diversity is important at Ivies. And he said if you look at CEOs and members of Congress and the Supreme Court and university presidents, I'm making the numbers up a little bit, but it was something like, and maybe you know the right numbers, but it was something like 35% of those people come from the Ivies plus 3 other elite institutions. And so obviously, if those institutions are not diverse, the leadership of our society will not be diverse. So I remember reading this. That was the first couple of paragraphs. And I literally laughed out loud because it didn't even occur to him. Like, it wasn't even a plausible thought in his head that one way you might address that is not having 30% of the leaders come from 11 institutions. That wasn't even a hypothesis worth raising. So if we could break out of that a little bit, I think it would make a difference. Now, I want to call myself out for being a rank hypocrite because my kids are going to college and we're looking at those institutions and we recognize the value of that. And so this is not easy, right? It forces us to break down our own biases and our own sort of logic models of how we advance our own self-interest. And who am I kidding? Did the fact that I have a degree from Harvard make a difference in my career? Yeah, it probably did. Does it make a difference that I taught at Yale for for 10 years? Yeah. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying because I know that it gets me in the door, right? But I also know that there are some really, really smart people, a lot of them, who went to Montclair State University. And by the way, who went to institutions further down the food chain, so to speak, than Montclair State University. So, because Montclair State University is pretty high up, right? So we need to figure out how to evaluate individuals and give people a chance outside of these traditional frameworks. It's always striking me, and I'm sure many people, because you're right, obviously, you all live in this world, you know, that you, if you talk about the Ivy League schools, they'll say, you know, we could have taken the 1,500 students we admitted, set them aside, and taken another 1,500, and they would have been just as good. And we could have taken that 1,500 and taken another 1,500, and they would have been just as good. And it's like, yeah, and yet the people at the consulting firms and whatever who do the job interviews, they're only interested in the first 1,500, and they've decided that they're superior to the other 3,000. That's reality. So if we can break down that mentality, which is an easier thing to say than to do, I think that would make a huge difference. I mean, I think people know that the Supreme Court, like, they're populated by people from a handful of institutions. It doesn't make any sense. Talent is not distributed that way in our country, and yet we act as if it is.
Absolutely. Before I open it up to the audience, I want to ask you the number one question I get asked, especially after the University of Texas chancellor, who was a 4-star admiral and a Navy SEAL, said that being a college president is the hardest job in the nation. Why do you do what you do, and what gives you the joy?
So this has been unusual. I'm sure you have this. This has been an unusual year because people kind of look at me with pity.
Absolutely.
I'm serious, and maybe we'll talk about the Israel-Gaza stuff. People may be interested in. We had some really interesting challenges at our university. We handled it a lot better than some institutions, but not because it wasn't challenging. And I had people on campus, like faculty and students. They're like, "I feel really sorry for you." I'm like, I'm okay. So let me give you the short version of a longer story. So my joke a little bit is about I'm like the least creative person in the world because my mother was an academic. My father was a politician. I became a political science professor, so I basically just averaged my parents. A little bit longer answer is I was raised in a family, and that's part of why my father was in politics. I was raised in a family where we were taught, like, you're supposed to make a difference in the world. Like, that's just part of the reason you're on the planet. You're supposed to do something valuable. And so I was asked, like, since I was 2 years old, like, when are you going to run for office and all that sort of stuff. And I decided relatively early on that actually there's this interesting thing called universities, which I was exposed to through my mother. And I was like, universities could be so much more than I think they are. Like, if they were, like, torqued to be problem-solving institutions, like, they could really make a difference. And so I ultimately decided, and I've sort of wavered on this my whole life, but that was in many ways a way to make a bigger difference than going into politics. Now, I did not know when I decided that American democracy was going to be under existential threat. So that might have weighed on my consciousness. But I still do believe, even on that point, right? And maybe we'll get into that. I do believe that universities are incredibly powerful engines, potentially, to be transformational agents in society. They have been historically. They've kind of retreated from that over the last 100 years. But I think they could reassert that role, and that's what attracted me to it, because I just think there's vast potential here.
Absolutely, and maybe some of them are retreating, and maybe some of them are going into battle like you are.
Well, I think one thing that people have realized is that retreating didn't make you safer. And so why retreat? Why not be engaged and proactive? And that's what we need to be doing on the democracy front, by the way. Like, I think a lot of universities are just, like, hunkering down and, like, I hope I'm not on CNN. And that shouldn't be it. It should be, no, how are we encouraging engagement and promoting the idea that students should be involved, but do it in a constructive, positive way.
Absolutely. So let me open it up to all of you to ask whatever's on your minds. Please.
What's your perspective on the role of community colleges in education today?
I think community colleges are essential. We encourage a lot of students to start their journey at a two-year college. First of all, many of them are better equipped to help students who are not quite ready to do college-level work. But more importantly, you bring the stakes down quite a bit, right? From a financial point of view, and even from a psychological point of view. I think the important thing, though, is that, this is what we're trying to do, is that a student who starts at a community college is on a very clear pathway to a four-year degree. Yes, that's transfer agreements, but what I would like to see is that a student who starts at a community college thinks of themselves as a Montclair student already. Every class is going to count. They're engaged in the community, and so they're not so much transferring as they are starting at a two-year institution, and then they'll complete their degree at a four-year institution. For those of you who don't know, a very high percentage of students, I actually don't know the numbers, start their journey at community colleges, and they've been very successful. The completion rates are often scary. And so there's a role for four-year institutions to partner with two-year institutions. This gets in the weeds a little bit, but this is going to become a bigger issue, and maybe why you're asking the question, because as we hit this demographic cliff and the number of people going to college is going to go down, four-year institutions are going to be trying to poach the students from the two-year institutions, and that's going to have two negative effects. One, it's going to put community colleges in serious peril, and two, it's going to bring students to four-year institutions who are not prepared to be at four-year institutions and who the four-year institutions are not good at helping to be successful. So it's sort of like, some of the climate change stuff, like it's this ecosystem, and one problem begets other problems. So it's a great question and something that I think is underappreciated in higher ed.
Yes, Nan.
I have a question. Let's go back to the student you gave an example of, the fellow who was working all night at the UPS store.
Mm-hmm.
And I know from experience that people, you have maybe older students who have to have jobs to support a family. How do you respond to that person if you know he's dropped out or she's dropped out?
So a couple different things there. So that's another big population of students, right? So it's interesting. We're talking about, it's great. I love these questions because we're talking about populations that are never discussed in the context of elite universities. So transfer students, many of them are returning students, adult learners, people who have had different trajectories. So part of what we're trying to do is to redesign how we offer education to meet the needs of those learners. So we have an initiative called Montclair Unbound. The idea of Montclair Unbound is to combine ways of learning. So COVID taught us it taught us two things. One, that actually it's easier to do online learning than people thought. Now, that wasn't new to me. I was at ASU. ASU is one of the big online universities, so I already kind of got that. But it also showed that people don't want or don't love 100% online, and they prefer at least some synchronous online versus asynchronous, like Zoom, right, as opposed to just everything online. We think that those folks that you're talking about, they want a mix, right? So they want some online that they can do on their own schedule. They want some synchronous online so they're interacting with people. And they do want some face-to-face because there is something still different about this, being in the same room together. And so we want to sort of put things together in a way that makes sense for for learners who have all these different obligations. And for our students, like, it's a big deal to come to campus, right? You've got to get a babysitter, you've got to get in your car, you've got to navigate traffic, parking, tolls, blah, 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 blah. And so you've got to figure out what's the right mix. And then the other part that's interesting when you start playing this out about how education needs to evolve, right? Like I really think we're like that fish that is discovering that it can work its way through the mud. Like, that's where we are in the evolution, and eventually we're going to grow legs, but we're still that fish, like, flopping around. People say, oh, well, you have to learn how to teach online, and you have to learn how to use the technology for distance education. It's like, no, that's not the hard part. The hard part is, what do you do in a classroom? Because if you're going to tell that guy to come to campus after pulling an all-night shift, and then he gets to campus and he's in a room and he just sits in a chair and somebody talks at him, he's like, this would have been better on YouTube, right? Like, I could have watched on my own time. I could have repeated it 3 times until I understood it. I could have pressed pause to feed my kid or go to the bathroom. So you got to figure out what to do in a room that's different. And that's how we need to evolve for that student. And we're not doing, like, we as an industry are not really doing it. It's all just, and this is a broader point, but it's all just, you have to adapt to us. You have to make your schedule work for us. No. Like, we should be adapting to the audience a little bit. In a way, we're serving them. I don't like that, because that gets into language of, like, the customer. Like, I feel a little queasy about that. But it's our job to help them be successful. It's not their job to adapt to our weird structural things. We just are implementing. It's going to cause, and it's causing, like, huge angst, right? We're just implementing a new calendar. And so the summer is essentially going to be the same structure as the fall and the spring, so that if a person wants to complete the degree continuously, they can. It's amazing to me that most places don't do that. Because why? Because people are going to work on the farm in the summer. Like, our kids aren't going to the Hamptons, right? So we need to change how we do things. And I got to tell you, like, that is not popular. People are like, but then the semester is a week shorter. I'm like, oh my God. So it is about our adaptation to the needs of that student. Yeah, there was a.
I have a question about trade schools. What are your thoughts about that? I work in Mount Olive Township
Yeah.
in New Jersey. We have a group of students that do go to the technical school in Denville during the school day and learn a trade.
I think they're good. Here's something that might be surprising to people about trade schools. So, as part of this policy institute that was part of my college in Arizona, we studied trade schools. They weren't called that, but we studied trade schools. Graduates of trade schools were more likely to go to college than graduates of traditional high schools. So, I have a
Mount Olive has a lot of special education.
Mm-hmm.
We have from different townships coming in there also. So these trade schools and also the work programs that these students have, and some start at the community college,
Right,
and go on further because they're on the spectrum.
so that's one population that's helped by that. But I think the reason why all populations do well is that I think for a lot of students, a trade school connects the education to the application in real time. And so for a student, telling a student, why should you learn this? Because it's on the exam. That's not very inspiring. But telling a student, you're going to use this tomorrow, and then they see it in real time, that makes a big difference. It's one of the reasons why we're trying to infuse hands-on and experiential learning into all of our degree programs, because it completely changes the educational experience when you go to an internship or you go to a job and you use what you're learning immediately. It makes it relevant. It makes it exciting. We have a program. We have a program called Green Teams, where students, actually it's students from 30 universities, but a lot of them are ours, and we run the program. They work as teams over the summer, and they work with companies and governments to solve sustainability problems. And I was talking to them, and I said, how many of you hate statistics? And like 3/4 of them raised their hands. I said, how many of you now hate it less because you used it on your projects? And everybody was like, yeah, like at least it makes sense. Like, why I have to learn this stupid thing? So I think trade schools are terrific. First of all, because for people who don't want to go to college, it's a pathway to employment. But I actually think it makes education relevant and more valuable.
I work here, and I just started working in the Nantucket Public School System, but still in New Jersey also. So it's quite challenging in both areas since COVID. Education has changed a bit.
COVID had a huge impact on young people in terms of, yeah.
Especially like you mentioned on Zoom, but a lot of students have problems doing Zoom and concentrating and all that, and they're coming back. And what I'm doing now, and I'm doing half and half computers and half actual actually teaching and interacting and all of that, going back a ways.
Yep.
So, yeah, which seems to be helping the students.
It's great.
There's other things, yeah.
I'm curious as to how many of your students graduate in 4 years?
For our 4-year graduation rate is in the high 50s, I think. That's not really the 6-year graduation rate is more relevant for an institution like Montclair. It's going up. It's going up actually because we're having more students who are trying to get done more quickly, I think for financial reasons, so they're figuring out how to do it. That's partially why a 12-month schedule is good. But for us, we focus on the 6-year rate.
Well, I agree with that completely, being involved in that, but I also think learning by doing since the beginning of time is the very best thing that you can possibly give a student.
The tricky part is, a lot of people learn by doing. They say, oh, do an internship. Oh, but we're not going to pay you. Things like that. So I'm very sensitive to the equity considerations when you create those experiential requirements and so on, because it's really challenging for some students, even to put it into their life, right? So I 100% agree, but we have to be a little bit more creative about how we do it.
So much of this starts before they get to you. It starts K through 12. You mentioned that before.
Yeah.
It's not related to access. That pipeline, I'm in this business, that pipeline is such an important. What have you found to be the most successful way? It's one thing when they apply to Montclair State, you'll find room for them, but there are a lot of talented, fabulous kids for whom this horizon just seems too big. It's just they can't quite get there. What can we do about bringing them into the system?
Well, I think there's a couple of things in your comment. One is we do have multiple challenges in the K-12 system. I agree the COVID interruption was significant. And it's like a snake eating an antelope, right? It's going to take a long time for that to work through the system. Our students, and I don't know if this is your experience too, our students, even with the same GPAs, are less prepared today than they were 5 years ago. It's really obvious. So we're doing more catch-up summer bridge programs, things that get people ready. I do think, and this is an interesting thing. I do think that the distribution of opportunity, even in areas where underrepresented groups don't go to college at the same rates, are different. And one of the things that I've been interested in is, well, why do first-gen students who end up in college, what's their story that's different, right? How do you explain it? And it does have something to do with the community. It does have something to do with the role models. It does have something to do with the access to alternative models. And so we recently, this is a longer story, but we recently kept an institution called Bloomfield College. We were talking about this a little bit before. An institution called Bloomfield College, which is New Jersey's only predominantly black institution. So New Jersey doesn't have any HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. And it has only one 4-year predominantly black institution. That's an institution which is 25% African American or more, for the most part. That's the definition. And we wanted to, or I didn't think it was right for Bloomfield College to close, to be honest. So we started by extending a line of credit, and ultimately we've acquired Bloomfield College. We call it a merger, but essentially that's what it is. And one of the reasons why I thought it was important was because I got to know the Bloomfield students, and I was talking to them. And let me be clear, Montclair is about 15% African American. Our entering class is reported, they report themselves to be 28% African American. So it's not like Montclair is not a friendly place for African American students. And but what was interesting to me when I would talk to the Bloomfield students, who on paper looked very similar, a higher proportion of them, and I just got it from anecdotally, right? A higher proportion of them came from environments where very few people went to college. Very few people. And the sort of stakes and the risk and the discomfort for them to take that leap was higher than even the first-gen students at Montclair. And so this goes to Janet's point about size and community. And so for those students, being in the small, more intimate Bloomfield environment seemed to make a difference. It was less of a leap. And so I think in some ways this is an extension of my answer to that question about adult learners. The question is, can we offer an environment that is suited for students where the challenge of getting to college and thriving in college is different, and requires a different solution. So that's what we're trying to do there. Now, I think part of the answer, frankly, is getting more talent into our schools. And a lot of what I've talked about Montclair making a difference and being engaged, I didn't bring that to the institution. I want to be clear. I went to Montclair because what I believe was consistent with the institution, and I think that owes to its origins as Montclair Normal School. We were created to train public school teachers, and that's still a core part of our mission. And we've got some innovative programs to get young people from those communities on a pathway to being a teacher in those communities. And we have a couple of successful venues where we're doing that in Newark. I think you need more of that, because that's how you show people what's possible. Role models matter. That connection matters. No matter how earnest I am, I'm not going to have the same impact as somebody who can speak to the experience of a young person in that community in a more direct way. But I have the same starting point, which is there's all of this talent that's just sitting there. Like, all these people could be authors and inventors and entrepreneurs, and it's just wasted. If we said, well, there's gold buried outside that street in front of this building, but we just choose not to dig it up, like, well, you'd think we were crazy, right? But I think that's what we're doing. I really do. I know that sounds sort of a little bit Pollyanna, but I really do think that's what we're doing. There was in the back, you were gonna. Okay, yeah.
How important is GPA to be accepted at Montclair State?
We have a high acceptance rate. But it's not 100%. And we accept 90% of this, roughly a little under 90% of the students that apply.
It took a certain percent A students.
Right.
Because they're not going to be good engineers. They'll be professors.
Yeah.
B students who could be there, and they took a bunch of C students because they'll be the best engineers. now what
That's interesting.
And he even took some D students who could underperform in high school, but when he got to college,
We're trying. So what we found is that GPA is not the right way to measure it. It's actually a set of it's specific courses, and so it's this is going to sound funny because you're like, it's 2024. Is this really the best way to do it? So in order to look course by course and say, look, these 8 courses matter the most, and basically say if a kid gets a B in every one of those 8 courses, they're probably going to be okay, regardless of what their GPA is. Exactly to your point. You would think that like we just get all the scores electronically. That's crazy talk. We get paper. We just get like pieces of paper. So it's just unbelievable. In 2024, I just approved, or our board technically approved. We bought this optical character recognition software to look at people's transcripts so we could do grade by grade analysis, because that gets us a better predictor of whether somebody's going to make it. The question to me is, and this goes back to completion rates, if you don't think you can get a kid across the finish line, then don't admit them. Right? You're not doing anybody any favors by admitting them if they're not going to finish. And by the way, that was happening at Bloomfield, and it's concerning. It happens at a lot of colleges. Why does it happen? Because they're desperate for bodies. They're desperate. And we think of that as for-profits, but remember what I said about community colleges? So one of the reasons you see graduation rates going down at 4-year institutions is because they take people with a pulse. And they know that the likelihood of completion is very low. In my opinion, that's morally indefensible. I mean, I'm not kidding. Like, it shocks the conscience. And so if you know how to do that, like take D students and get them across the finish line, then amen, brother, do it. But once, in my opinion, when you accept somebody, you now said that kid's capable of completing college, and if they don't finish, that's on you. That's how I view it. Yeah.
Appealing to you as the son of a politician and academic mother, why is it, and I know you must spend a lot of time fundraising, why is it that college presidents today don't have the opportunity to be in a political pulpit as they used to?
Well, so it's not just a matter of time. It's not just a matter of time. This is now like this big controversy about the extent to which universities and university presidents should be commenting on the issues of the day. And there are these, what is it, Calvert principles,
Calvin principles.
that got a lot of attention, where the University of Chicago says, don't talk about anything. Basically, you don't take a position on anything. I think that's too far. I do think that, and I tend to be more outspoken than most. But I try to focus on things that are relevant to us, as opposed to commenting on the issues of the day, because I'm not sure why we would do that, and it is fraught. So I remember it was relatively early on at my time at Montclair, Russia invades Ukraine. And people are like, you need to say something. You need to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I was like, first of all, I don't know that anybody really cares whether the president of Montclair State University condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Second of all, why? Do we have a foreign policy? And third of all, and this is the most important one, what about all the other things I haven't commented on? I haven't commented on the Rohingya. I haven't commented on the Uyghurs. I actually said at the time, I haven't said anything about what's happening to the Palestinians. I said, there's myriad things I could have commented on, but I did not. When it's relevant to our community, okay. And so we ultimately created a lecture position for a Ukrainian scholar who was displaced. And I did a statement about why we were doing that and why we used our resources to create a position for a Ukrainian scholar. that seemed relevant because it was about us and what we could do. I didn't send out a statement on October 8th saying this is a horrible thing. And some people were unhappy that I didn't do it. I did send out a statement, I don't know, a few days later, or maybe it was a week later, about our campus's reaction to what was going on and how we as a community could stay together and could embrace concerns for all people involved. And that seemed appropriate because it was about our community. I think that's important. Now, am I outspoken about higher education? Am I outspoken about the role that universities should play? Am I willing to get out there and particularly defend things around diversity and inclusion and why these are important for universities? Yes, and I think I have a particular obligation because unlike my colleagues in Texas and Florida, I won't lose my job for doing it, right? But I think that's why universities have been reluctant, is because what you choose to talk about becomes a statement in and of itself, and I think that is a perilous thing. I don't know what your thoughts are on this. I'm sure you've had this question too.
Absolutely, and I think what we want to do is to make sure that students remain comfortable. So if you have a university president who's taking a political stance on something, then the other students who are not in that camp end up feeling uncomfortable, like the community isn't there to support them. So what we try to do is foster dialogue, just create spaces for people to come together. So after October 7th, we had spaces where people were doing expressive art therapy, or they were speaking to each other in ways that they used in educational forums. That was more powerful to allow our students to explore it than anything I could have done.
I would like to thank you, Dr. Koppell, for coming and giving us such an enlightening talk. It was so interesting, and thank you both for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Can I just say thank you again? Thank you for just a lively conversation. And thank all of you for coming and being so concerned about higher education. It's obviously something where we can answer the question, why do we do this? Because of the wonderful work that people like Jonathan are doing.
I agree 100%.
So
I really appreciate your interest. It's fantastic. Thank you.